This video will discuss the roof tiles for the Dollar Store Dollhouse. For many of the old stone colonial homes, they often had slate roof tiles, and I wanted to recreate the appearance of slate. There were faux slate roof tiles that could be purchased, but I wanted to find a cheap alternative. I had seen tutorials online where plaster was applied to mat board to create roof slate tiles. I thought this was one of the more realistic recreations that I had come across. I first experimented with a strip of the foam sheet and plastic wood filler and applied this to create a rough texture on the surface of the foam sheet. After this dried, I painted this with gray paint. Once the paint dried, I cut these into small pieces. The result was good, but I decided to try some black paint, which I liked better. The black chalkboard paint was left over from another project, so it's better to use than discard sometime in the future. I wanted to also experiment with the drywall compound. This would be a much more economical solution if this worked effectively. I spread this unevenly over the surface of the foam sheet, allowed this to dry, and lightly sanded to remove the peaks. I painted the samples with gray paint and cut into 1 inch by 3/4 inch pieces. I penciled lines on a scrap piece of foam board at 1/2 inch intervals and covered the surface with the overlapping roof tiles. I treated the surface with a black wash, which helped give the tiles more dimension. I later painted this with black chalkboard paint and applied a gray wash over the surface as the ultimate treatment. This looked good, but the drywall easily pulled away from the foam surface. It occurred to me to try using caulking on the surface of the foam sheet. With this, the surface was textured and left to dry. I would not be able to sand this material down, unlike the other products. I performed one last comparison between the plastic wood filler and the caulking. The overall texture of the wood filler was preferable, but it did flake slightly around the edges when cut and would be a more expensive solution. The caulk provided a very stable adherence to the foam and looked reasonably good when painted. The caulk was also obtained from the dollar store, which reinforced the theme of the house. I discarded all of the drywall tiles and went forward to produce the tiles using the caulking. I estimated that it took approximately 2,000 tiles to cover the entire roof and around 3 packages of the foam sheets and 2 of the caulking tubes. To reiterate the final procedure, I squeezed out a small portion of the caulk onto the foam sheet. I dipped the spackle into the container of water to very lightly coat the blade. I smeared the caulk over the surface of the foam sheet by randomly spreading and lifting the blade to create ridges and peaks that produce the slate texture. My technique improved over the many attempts, and I would akin the process to the knockdown drywall texture found in many California homes. First, peaks of the caulking are formed over the surface, and then the spackle is again dipped in the water and the spackle is lightly dragged over the surface in many directions. Very little force is applied to spread and knock down the peaks. The caulk is allowed to dry before applying a coat of black paint and then wait some additional time for the paint to dry. I tried to always have these drying while working with finished tiles. Because the foam sheets are not perfectly square, I would cut down the sheets to 3 3/4 inch by 5 inch rectangle. Much of the excess strips could be used as filler for small pieces needed around the openings and at the end of a row. I would then cut 3/4 inch width strips lengthwise, then 1 inch width in the opposite direction. The cutting board with the ruler markings made this process much easier. I would square up the sheets to the perpendicular lines and align the square edge ruler to the markings on the cutting board. To help keep the sheets in place, I found a small wood file that acted as a weight to keep the pieces from shifting. This produced the 1 inch wide by 3/4 of an inch high tiles. The exposed edges of the foam sheets will later be touched up with paint once in place. For the roof, I created an outer roof layer using black foam board. The black surface would blend with the black roof tiles and help hide any defects between the gaps. Since the structural roof was already built with the 30-inch length limit of the board, the outer shell had to be created by splicing pieces together to create the desired length. I wanted this to be approximately 1/8 of an inch extended beyond the trim that will be applied to the structural roof. I fashioned trim for the side peaks to get accurate measurements of the outer roof. I taped the seams of the spliced pieces together using drywall tape and sealed this with glue. The drywall tape was applied to both the outer side and the inner side of the board to create a more rigid solution. Having an outer layer had the advantage of installing the roof tiles on a flat work surface before placing the outer roof onto the house. The first guideline was drawn at 3/4 of an inch from the bottom, and subsequent lines were drawn at 1/2 inch intervals. I penciled the horizontal lines across the length of the board. Holes were cut into the board to accommodate the dormer windows and chimney, which will be discussed in a separate video. After a sufficient number of the roof tiles were created, I began gluing these to the foam board with the glue stick. The first row was flush with the bottom edge, and subsequent rows were flush with the top of the pencil line. The tiles were staggered in the same manner as an actual roof is tiled. A few of the initial tiles were created with wood filler and had paint peel, but with paint touch-up this would not be visible. I periodically touched up the cut edge of the exposed foam with paint. Additionally, the raw edge of the foam board was also painted black to blend with the roof tiles. When I got to the dormer opening, I penciled the bottom level line for that row, cut the tiles to fit, and glued in place. I dry fit the dormers to ensure that the tiles were snug around the dormer. After completing the tiling, I went over the surface with a watered down black wash. This would seep into the crevices and give the surface a more uniform appearance and cover up some of the colored foam sheets. You can see how the sample with the gray wash looks compared to the roof with just the black paint. This takes off some of the sheen and looks a bit more like black slate. The entire surface of the roof tiles are covered with the gray wash. The gray wash is comprised of 3 parts of white and 1 part black craft paint, and enough water to allow the wash to lightly coat the surface. After applying the wash, the excess is blotted with paper towels. The outer roof shell is then hung over the structural roof like a new jacket. The glue was smeared over the structural roof and the outer roof was attached. Clothespins and tape were used to hold the foam boards together while the glue was drying. A rug was draped over the roof to hold it in place. This applies a constant, gentle pressure to keep it held snug while drying. After one side was adhered, the other side was then glued in the same manner. With all the glue, paint, and wash used on the surface of the foam board, this did have the effect of causing a slight curvature in the board. I did not notice at the time I first glued the outer shell over the structure, but over a short period of time, the structural roof pulled away from the house. If I had realized how much pull this would exert on the structural roof, I would have tried to mitigate the curvature of the roof. I found a technique using a blow dryer to help remove the warping that might have been useful to apply to the outer roof before this was glued down. Once that was set, I completed the ridge cap by overlapping the tiles with 1/2 inch spacing. To improve the bend down the middle of the tile, I would lightly score the back using a straight edge and X-Acto knife. I used small booklets to apply pressure on the tiles as the glue was setting up. I will go over the completion of the roof in a video covering the dormers. Thanks for watching.